Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see all of you. My name is Brianna Steer, and I'm the Developmental Disabilities Program Coordinator for Skagit County. I'll just do a little bit of an introduction of the DD program and the why behind this presentation series, and then I'll turn it over to Sherwood Community Services, who will be hosting today's presentation. So as I said, I work for the Skagit County Developmental Disabilities Program. Every county in the state has a DD program that receives federal and state funding to coordinate and manage services for people with disabilities from age birth all the way through adulthood. One of the main focuses of our program is related to coordinating and providing employment services for people with disabilities or developmental disabilities specifically. And so we have 3 supported employment providers in Skagit County who work with adults age 21 and over to provide on-the-job support for positions that people want out in the community. A lot of times we think of employment for people with disabilities as, models where they're isolated and away from the community, but those times have changed, and we are now in what we call integrated community employment. And so we have over 100 people in Skagit County who want to work or are working in the community. We currently have about 90 people in Skagit County who are working and about 80 who are looking for jobs. And as I said, those jobs are individualized based on the person's desires and their goals, and they have an employment specialist who usually walks alongside them. So part of the goal of this series is to talk a little bit more about inclusion in our community. We know that diversity and equity has been a hot topic the past couple years, and for good reason, but that inclusion piece of the conversation often gets missed. And so the point of this presentation series is to talk a little bit more about how to further inclusion efforts in our community, and kind of the umbrella of that conversation today is around what does inclusion look like in the workplace. So I'm pleased to introduce Lance Morehouse and Angie Ramsey from Sherwood Community Services.
Thank you, Lisa. And I am going to share our presentation here, but not starting there. There we go. All right. Everybody can see the PowerPoint now? Thumbs up? Yeah, yep. Good. Yay. Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity to come and talk about supported employment. And we're going to talk a little bit about communication and some strategies. This is a presentation that Angie and I put together. I am Lance Morehouse. I'm the CEO of Sherwood Community Services. I go by pronouns he and him, and I'm a white male wearing glasses in a blue shirt in an office setting with metal art on the wall behind me.
Awesome. And I'm Angie Ramsey. I'm the vocational manager for Sherwood for Island and Skagit counties. I am a white female with short, kind of sandy blonde hair. I have some little white earbuds in, or navy blue blazer, also in an office setting, but it's blurred behind me. The artwork actually on my wall is made by some of my clients and somebody else with disabilities who made it into a wall calendar. And I go by pronouns she, her.
So we introduced ourselves that way because it's one accommodation for people who may have visual impairments and disabilities. And it's just goes to show how you can present yourself in a respectful manner so that if there are people with disabilities that are on this call, they get a picture in their mind at least about who is speaking. So thank you very much for letting us introduce ourselves in that way. So let me tell you just a little bit about Sherwood, and then we'll jump into the content. So Sherwood provides services to children and adults with disabilities. We've been around for about 64 years, established in 1957. And if you look at our mission, we provide innovative and inclusive services for children and adults with disabilities in their communities. And The only thing that I'd like to highlight in that is the words innovative and inclusive. Those are strong words in our mission that mean something. They're not just words. And depending on who you talk to, they may have a different view on what the word innovation or inclusion means. But for us, we always strive to use best practices, and we want people to be included in their communities in every way possible as contributing members. So I'm going to give a brief overview of early intervention. It's not what we're going to talk about today, but this is how we serve children. We provide early intervention services to infants and toddlers birth to 3. We have on staff occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech language pathologists, educators, and FRCs. And we use a parent coaching model in our early intervention program, which means we work with the families as well as the child in providing therapy. So the therapy doesn't just last during the session while the therapist is there. It actually, the parents can continue on and figure out how to incorporate that into everyday activities. During normal times, we provide these services in natural environments, which could be the family's home, a daycare, a park. During COVID, we've had to switch and do a lot of the virtual services. So that's just a brief overview of our early intervention program, and I'll hand it off to Angie.
Awesome, thank you. So kind of my specialty within Sherwood is vocational services. So obviously Brianna kind of set us up. We're going to be talking more about the workplace today and how inclusion and integration works in the workplace. But if you didn't attend last week or you haven't heard of vocational services for adults with developmental disabilities, it has a lot of different names. Some people call it job coaching. We might be employment specialists, employment consultants, specialized employment. All of those kind of terms get bandied about, and they all kind of mean the same thing, which is we tailor our services to the individual that we're supporting, and they have some type of barrier to employment. Sometimes or most times in the case of our services, it's they're experiencing an intellectual or developmental disability. But we also support folks with a broad range of disabilities. So it might be physical and not intellectual. They might have a learning disability. They might be experiencing homelessness or addiction or mental health challenges or some cocktail of any of those. So those are the folks that we support, and they're tailored and individualized services. So we really get to know the person that we're working with and what their skills and abilities are. And then we find a good match with a business partner in the community for employment. So that's kind of a little bit about what we do. We have a video, actually, I think Lisa was the one who shared it with me, that we want to share with you guys that kind of gives a nice visual of this story of like, how does this work and what does it look like? So I'm going to show you the video without too much intro, and then we'll have some discussion afterwards. And let me know, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. I checked the box, but just want to make sure.
The baker had Simone, and everybody saw that she could do the job. The lawyer went to the baker and saw Simone at work. The lawyer hired John because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The dentist went to the lawyer and saw John at work. The dentist had Sophia because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The farmer went to the dentist and saw Sophia at work. The farmer had Kate because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The barber went to the farmer and saw Kate at work. The barber had Paul because the farmer had Kate, because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer had John, because the baker had Simone. The baker had Simone. The baker went to the barber and saw Paul at work. He didn't have a clue, but it was thanks to his first move that The barber hired Paul because the farmer hired Pete, because the dentist had Sophia, because the lawyer hired John, because the baker had Simone, the baker had Simone, the baker had Simone. Yeah,
Okay. So what did that bring up for you? I see Heather has a little heart. I love that video. But what did that bring up? Have you seen similar experiences? Is there anything that you can share of like, oh yeah, I've seen that in play?
I'll jump in. To me, it's overwhelmingly exciting to see our employers in our community hiring folks with developmental disabilities, not only from a parent perspective, because I have an adult child with disabilities, but just the feel of community, right? And I love shopping or giving business to those organizations and employers that hire folks with disabilities, because it's just exciting, you know, to see that everybody has something to contribute to our community. So I love that video. I could watch it every day. It's just very joyful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought that up because I want to give kind of a shout out to Skagit County. You probably already know this one, Heather, but so Brianna, do you want to jump in and talk about the kind of map of businesses who hire inclusively and how where that's gonna roll out and when?
Sure. Yeah, so we have heard a lot from people in the community that they'd love to know, what businesses they can support and where in regards to who is practicing inclusive hiring. And so we are getting ready to roll out a map. I wish I had an exact date, but it'll be before October. It's with our GIS, or Geographic Information Services, I think is their acronym. I probably butchered that, but basically they are our mapping department and at Skagit County, and they do all the property maps for the assessor's office and our sheriff's incidents report. And so we're merging with them to do this cool map that highlights those businesses that have hired people with developmental disabilities. So it's a little bit unique in that it only shows those that are participating in a supported employment program, because that's the only data I can find. But we know there's a lot of other businesses out there who've hired people with disabilities that aren't specific to our program. So that's one of the limitations. But in general, it'll live probably on the DD program webpage, which I just linked in the chat, and it'll be updated probably quarterly, but for the most part, it'll be live, and you're welcome to go on there and you'll be able to sort by sector to see, hey, I want to go out to dinner tonight. Where can I, support that has hired a person with a disability? So I'll be sure to loop the chambers in once that is released. And yeah, we're really excited about it.
Yeah, super cool. Thank you, Brianna. Other reactions from the video or just things it brought up for you?
When I first watched the video, like obviously I had like a very emotional reaction. It was, I think I even like cried. And I love the video. I think it's great. But I wish that there was a way to incorporate more into the messaging and the intent of what we're trying to get out, that when you hire someone with a disability, you should be doing it more than just the emotional piece of it. It should be because like strategically it's cost efficient for your business. Like if there's just a way to like break down that type of pull for the community, I think that it could help like wean out kind of like the tokenization of doing inclusive hiring. Because
Morgan, I could not have planted that comment. Like I couldn't have planted you in the audience to say that like any better. Because like, yeah, absolutely. This is a feel good thing. And a piece of that message is like the baker hired Simone because she could do the job, you know? And then we see everybody working. So I guess like the last thing that I would throw in there is just like the normalization piece of it, you know. I forget the names of the people who did this study, but are you guys familiar with the study that was done with like preschoolers and toddlers, that the more their parents spoke to them, the more words and vocabulary they used around their kids, the higher their academic achievement, like throughout their time in K through 12? It's these same people who it's even part of the study that like 80% of the things we learn, we absorb from our environment. And so I think there's like this really powerful beauty to this idea of inclusion that we're seeing in many different areas, just not just employment. But that like the more we normalize that, yeah, people with developmental disabilities work, you know, and they're good at their jobs and they do those things, they're part of the community. Like the more that's normalized, we're just absorbing that, and that continues forward. But to get to your point, Morgan, unless anyone has any other kind of reactions from that video, I don't want to move on too fast.
I just wanted to share that it really shows the power of word of mouth. You know, seeing people, but really what makes a difference, I think, for a business owner that may be hesitant to move forward with supported employment is to hear from another business owner who's taken that step and knows the benefits. And then it just shows to me in smaller communities where you know people, I mean, Everett, Seattle are huge, and I'm not saying the Burlington or Mount Vernon area are small. They're much bigger than the city that I live in. But still, you know those families, you know that student when they graduate from high school, and sometimes that's a real powerful thing that small communities have around supported employment.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. So yeah, so to kind of address one of Morgan's concerns there, because I think you're spot on, you know, like it makes you feel good and it warms your heart, and like there has to be a benefit for the business as well, because you don't get to do great cool stuff that adds to your community unless you're still in business, and so it, you know, it has to be profitable for you. So we listed some of the reasons why accessing this talent pool and why partnering with supported employment can be a benefit to your business. And I pulled some data from a report called The Inclusive Talent Pool Employing People with Disabilities. And this was written, they did their first version in 2014, and then they updated in 2019. So this comes from the 2019 report. But it was written by the I4CP, it stands for the Institute for Corporate Productivity. So clearly this is this is their shtick, you know, this is why they're around. So some of the statistics around employing people with specifically intellectual and developmental disabilities was a big part of a big focus in their report. Who receive employment support. They found that folks with disabilities have 48% higher tenure in their jobs. So some of that turnover problem that you might see in your business, this is a great solution for that. They stay almost 50% longer. They have 34% fewer accidents at work. One of the things we hear from a lot of potential employers that we're building a relationship with is, well, you know, my L&I is really high and I can't afford more accidents at work. My insurance is going to go through the roof. But we find that the data does not bear out that folks with disabilities have more accidents at work. They actually have 34% fewer than the general population. There's 40% lower absenteeism. So they're showing up to work much more consistently than their peers without disabilities. And kind of that last bugaboo we hear from a lot of employers is, well, that's really nice, but like I need everybody to be efficient and performing at the top of the game, right? And again, the data just doesn't bear out that that's a big concern for employees with disabilities. Actually, 90% perform at the same efficiency rate or better than their peers without disabilities. So some of the myths that are kind of out there that have to do a lot with kind of the history of folks with disabilities in our society and our communities, they don't bear out. They're actually like the vast majority of the folks that we're supporting are your stellar employee. You know, they're the ones who get incredible rave reviews and just say, please, you know, stick around. You're providing a huge benefit to our business. And I think the hiring chain kind of speaks to, once you see that it's working here, you can kind of imagine, yeah, I could see how it could work here in my business. And so, so that's kind of the business case, the actual efficiency, and the data case for why it really makes sense for employers. We also find that we can meet business needs really creatively. So a lot of our folks fill a specific need and like a special niche within the business that employs them. We have a lot of folks who come in to do 2, 3, 4 very specific tasks that aren't getting done by other employees who are focused elsewhere. They have too many things on their plate. So our folks can a lot of times come in, if we've built that great relationship and partnership with our supported employer, they can communicate to us where their gaps are, and then we can really fill that niche. So some examples would be like, especially during COVID, we have multiple people who are now coming in, and it's their job at the beginning of their shift to go sanitize all of those high touch points that's just not getting taken care of in regular day-to-day business. We also have a lot of like, you know, customer outreach marketing kind of pieces, like stuffing mailers and things. Those, a lot of times, like those things aren't getting done because it's like, oh, we'll do that next month. Yep, we got it. We know we need to send out birthday cards to our clients. We just haven't gotten to it yet. We're putting out all the fires. So we can get really creative about how we can meet those needs and really like grow the business. And, you know, a piece of that I've already touched on a little bit is like those folks who have high tenure in your business. Maybe they are highly skilled. They have a lot of experience in your industry. It can really free those folks up to get some of the pieces off of their plate that are not worth their time, and get them into some more growth focused tasks. And then, of course, you get coaching and support from employment specialists, whether that's through Sherwood or through another agency, and it's free for your business. So those are some of the kind of like tangible takeaways of like, why would supported employment work for me? And I don't want to spend too much more time on it because I know we want to focus more on communication, but I will send it over to you, Lance.
So working towards the communication part of this presentation, it's interesting to look a little bit at history and people with disabilities. So the picture at the top of this picture is Rainier School in Buckley, which is an institution for people with disabilities. So part of this around supported employment is historically people with intellectual and developmental disabilities early in the 20th century were put in institutions, and their families were told that this is the best place for them. They were put in programs that were segregated, isolating. There was forced sterilizations in some of them. And so when you think about the history of people, the use of the word retard, you know, I was a teenager once. We used this as slang. I didn't understand the impact of that word, but in our field, many people with disabilities refer to that as the R word. They won't even say it. And one of the worst slurs that you can use against people with disabilities. People with disabilities were considered second-class citizens with no rights. Many times, whether it was appropriate or not, they had guardianship put over them. In many cases, that's appropriate, but in many cases, it was not. And the courts in historical times just said, of course, a person with a disability needs a guardian. And then in 1972, we actually got a law passed in Washington State called the Education for All law that started the special education programs in public schools that we know today. And one of the origins of Sherwood is families had sons and daughters that weren't allowed to attend public schools. So they formed Sherwood, hired a teacher to prove that children with intellectual and developmental disabilities could learn. So it was before special ed, and schools served all kids with disabilities. And that was a changing point. So we'll go on to people with disabilities in the present. So that's the history. This is what we think around people with disabilities today, that they're fully included and integrated in their communities, that we use respectful language, and we're going to go into that a little bit in the future. But one quick example on that, I don't know if businesses and those of you in your communities have noticed parking in parking lots used to be designated as handicap parking. And now if you look at the signage should say accessible parking. There may still be a few of those old signs out there. But this was in direct response to people with disabilities going to the state legislature and wanting respectful language. So you go down the list, changing social perception. We all probably at some point in our life, and maybe still do, have stereotypes around people with disabilities. People should have the same rights and opportunities, right to public education, early intervention services, opportunities for employment. I mean, regardless of the severity of the disability, every adult should at least have the opportunity for employment. And that's kind of what we and Brianna's program in Skagit County try to promote, and the other agencies. And then self-determination is kind of a buzzword, but think about it in your own life. You get to make decisions on your life and where you want to go. So we should expect the same thing for people with disabilities. So values, I'm not going to go through this list, but this is just a few values that we have for people with disabilities when we think about the big picture. Really, the only thing that I would say about this is it's the same values that you and I would want to have in our lives. People with disabilities are no different. They should have the opportunities, same opportunities that we have in our community.
Gotta unmute. Yeah, so thank you. So I think that our main topic for the day is kind of communication, respectful language, and communication strategies you can use with your employees or coworkers with disabilities. So when I think about communication, I try and kind of like strip it down to like, okay, well, what is communication? It's an exchange of information, right, between two or more people. And I think it's like, I really appreciate Lance providing a little more historical perspective, because I think like all our communication it's contextual. It's based on our values and beliefs, and what we believe about someone or a set of people, or that is going to determine how we interact with that person, how we show up. So I love this quote. It's really talking about like how we tailor communication. So it's only effective when we communicate in a way that is meaningful to the recipient, not ourselves. And we all know this. We all do this consciously or unconsciously. You talk to your kids differently than you talk to your coworkers, and you talk to your friends differently than you talk to your parents. We're all tailoring our communication all day long. And so I think just having an awareness of like, what are the values and beliefs and experiences that I'm bringing to my communication with this individual. I think like being able to unpack that a little bit is going to help us all be a little more effective. And we're all on the journey. I don't think, you know, Lance, you've been in this industry much longer than I, but I'm guessing you don't feel that you've arrived. I certainly don't. So I mean, we're all on a journey. So I've put together some kind of adaptive communication tips and tricks. So like kind of the basics, which are really this applicable to all communication, right? So I'm wondering if anyone on the call has been part of like a trauma-informed workplace or trauma-informed care. There are kind of a lot of trauma-informed models that might have come out to you in some way. But if you think about that model and that training, it's all about acknowledging and accounting for the fact that everyone has experienced and possibly is experiencing trauma. And trauma can be, you know, there's like a very wide definition of like, it's a stressful situation, it's an encounter with somebody, it's an experience that you've had that affects the way you show up in the world. So that's one of the pieces that I think is like really foundational to thinking about like how do you show up for the people that you work with or who work for you is just recognizing that, especially given the light of the history that Lance has just went over, is people who experience disabilities of any variety have experienced trauma, because everyone has. But also the history of folks with disability in our society makes it much more likely that the trauma that they've experienced has been highly impactful to their life, and especially if it's a visible disability. So they are currently experiencing and dealing with the fallout from trauma. And so I think keeping that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about how am I interacting with and communicating with a person with a disability, like that's really important to keep in mind. So one of the first kind of tips and tricks, start at the beginning, right, is the etiquette of approach. I think we all have probably a family member or a friend who has that like really high startle response. Like you walk into the room and you say, hey, what's up with the laundry? You know, and that person's gonna like through the roof, like jump 3 feet, like, I didn't know you were there. So that you've probably learned when you're around that person, like quick knock on the door, like, hey, I'm coming in the room, whatever, that kind of a thing. That's kind of a nice thing to keep in mind with folks who are experiencing developmental delays, is that they probably have some kind of sensory thing happening that's really common. Either they have a sensory processing delay, or maybe they have certain sensory triggers that are more sensitive than you might find with others. So that kind of like knock on the door, the etiquette of approaching somebody softly and gently, nice thing to keep in mind and just be aware about. Volume. So this is one, I see myself doing this with like other people's kids all the time. I talk really loudly to children, and I don't know why. Like I have to remember to like rein it in. I'm talking to another human being, even if they're learning English, like they can still hear me just fine. So that's one of the things that I commonly see with folks who maybe just, they don't interact on a regular basis with folks with disabilities. You get kind of loud, and that can be for many reasons. It could be because you're nervous. It could, you know, you're tailoring your communication, but that's one to like keep a little mental note, like I don't need to tailor it in that way. Volume can be normal. So that leads me to, has anybody heard of paralanguage? Do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about paralanguage? Anybody? Okay. So you've probably heard of body language. Body language is that, you know, I'm talking with my hands. I'm doing a lot of body language right now. paralanguage talks about like all of the pieces of your communication that are not about the words that you're saying. So it's your volume, it's the tone of your voice, it's your expression, it's how quickly or slowly you're speaking, it's how you're holding your body. Or do you have your hands on your hips? Are you talking with your hands a lot? Like, what does that look like? And so I think just an awareness about like how you're presenting to somebody else is always important. If you're speaking to someone who has some sensory sensitivities, probably I need to stop with my like talking with my hands thing. I need to put them in my lap. A lot of folks that we support are pretty sensitive to tone. If they, it really, you know, it depends on the person, right? It always depends on the person that you're talking to. Some people prefer that you're blunt, direct, to the point. Some people really prefer that you step around it a little bit, you know, put some nice fluffy language in there and talk, you know, speak to them very gently. So just knowing that everyone has different preferences of how they're approached and communicated with, just keeping those things in mind goes a long way. And obviously, like the biggest part, I feel like this whole slide, the biggest piece of this is just like empathy, right? I'm going to put myself in your shoes and think about like, are there power dynamics at play? Is there especially from employer to employee, there's a power dynamic at play. And so it's really on the person who's in the position of greater perceived power or actual power to have empathy for that person and think like, how is my communication best going to be received by this person? So it communicates the information that I most want to exchange with them. And the other piece of this too is being still and listening. So I think a lot of times we as humans, I know I certainly do this when I am nervous or uncomfortable. I tend to like jump in and fill the void with words. And I think just remembering that it's good to kind of take a break and listen and be ready to give somebody extra time to like come to where you are and not necessarily go to them every time. Any questions or like thoughts, stories on any of these pieces before I move on? It's always my tendency to just move on, but I'm going to be still and listen and give you another 30 seconds in case anything comes up for you. Okay, hearing nothing, I will proceed. So piece of kind of leading into that being still and listening is processing time. So when I talk about adaptive communication, I guess I kind of rushed over that piece. When I talk about adaptive communication, I really just mean like, how are you tailoring your communication to your audience? So that's all I mean by that. But processing time is a big one that we see that gets in the way of the relationship between the employee and the employer. I used to work with a young man who was a dishwasher in a restaurant setting. He was a dishwasher, but he had lots of other kind of back of house duties, right? And as happens in restaurants, it's a pretty fast-paced environment. His priorities would change. It wasn't always, I'm doing this, you know, I walk in, I do these things, I do this and I leave. His employer, it was really up to his employer to let him know what the priorities for that shift were going to look like. And so one of the things that we ran into that became an obstacle was the employer would give a direction and say, hey, instead of doing the dishes, I really need you to go out to the front and wipe down the tables and do the bussing first. Well, this young man had a pretty significant processing delay. That instruction was going to kick in about 4 or 5 minutes. So he would come in and he would start doing the dishes, even though his boss just said, hey, I need you to go bus first. So his employment specialist kind of thought about, okay, the perception on the part of the employer is he's not taking my direction. Why is he not doing what I'm asking him to? The perception on the part of the employee was, well, I'm doing my job and I want to do a good job, so why is she upset with me? And we were able to kind of turn that into, okay, this is a communication breakdown. So when he came in, the first thing that he did was not go talk to employer, and employer did not come talk to him. Employer built the task list before he arrived to show him what the priorities were. So he kind of knew, don't go in and start anything, go in and look at the list and find the priority. And that really helped. The visual helped him because he didn't have the verbal processing delay. It didn't take him as long to integrate that new information. And he knew to expect the information is going to be new. It's not going to be my kind of like baseline task is go wash dishes. It's going to be whatever my employer is telling me, and my employer is going to tell me visually. So she would highlight on his task list. We just had a dry erase marker there. Highlight on the task list, this is what's going to happen first. So that processing time thing it's like such a tricky one, because you don't know if that person's going to have a delay of 10 seconds and you just need to wait for an answer, or are they going to have a delay of 5 minutes? And we really need to find a workaround strategy. But there usually is one. If you can kind of like take the personality piece out of it, which I think really gets in the way of like, why is he not listening to me? If we can take that piece out of it and just look at like, okay, the information is not being exchanged properly, there's a workaround, like there's a solution to that. And I think as an employer, having a knowledge that maybe things are not as they seem is just helpful. It's helpful for moving forward together. Another piece of this is communication. So communication coming from a person with a pretty significant intellectual disability, it can look kind of frightening, and it's hard to know what to do with that. But so those of us who've kind of been in the industry for a while, we have this saying, all behavior is communication. And that's true for everyone. It's not just true for people with developmental disabilities. You know, if you're showing up late for work every day, no matter who you are, you're communicating to your boss that work and timeliness is not a priority for me. So when we think about folks who are quite impacted by their disability and maybe they don't communicate linguistically, we want to think about like, what are the pieces of their behavior that are showing me something, that are an insight into how I can relate to this person and how we can have a relationship together as employee and employer. And there are some common misunderstood behaviors that are typically part of the disability that don't have to do with the employer and only sometimes have to do with the environment. So folks who kind of get loud, maybe they talk really loud or they start shouting, maybe they're running, scripting. If you've ever heard somebody kind of like saying the same thing over and over again, or maybe a line from a movie over and over again. Vocalization, so like it kind of sounds like moaning or whining, or different people have different kind of vocal sounds that they might make, and it's usually a piece of stimming. So if you see somebody rocking a lot, rocking back and forth, or maybe they're doing something with their hands or their fingers, or I had somebody who used to keep either a hat or a picture frame with him, and he'd spin them, and it's just it's a stimming thing. It's calming for them. It has to do with the disability and how that feels and how they're coping with what's being asked of them. And so sometimes just allowing that behavior to be, and then figuring out like, great, this is this person and this is how they present, like, how can we integrate that into what we do? Is there any way we need to manage that or not? And usually the answer is usually not. We don't need to manage that behavior in any way. No one's got a problem with it. So just recognizing that like sometimes those behaviors don't have to do with environment or communication. It just has to do with what's going on inside that person. It'll make it easier to then figure out how that exchange of communication is going to work. And then some nonverbal and non-linguistic communication strategies. So they're high tech and low tech. The lowest of low tech is task list, which we use a lot for a lot of people because visual communication is always helpful. But it might mean an interpreter for American Sign Language, or maybe they use a tablet to help them, hit the buttons that say, I want to go on a break. Just embracing that different folks have different communication strategies if they don't prefer to use language as their main form of communication. So we have one last video we want to show you, and it's about people first language. So Lance, did you have any setup or anything that you wanted to share about this video?
I don't think so. Let's just go ahead and share it and then take the same minute or two afterwards for any reflection that people have.
Perfect. All right.
What is person first language? What is person first language? Person first language puts the person ahead of any disability identifier, meaning a person who has autism or a person with an intellectual disability. Why is this important? A person with a disability is a person first. People with disabilities do not want to be seen first and foremost by their disability. It devalues their inherent uniqueness and personhood. Additionally, a person who uses an assistive device is not bound by it. A person who uses a wheelchair, for example, is much freer to move around this world because of their chair. This stems from the social model of disability. A person is disabled by lack of access to their community and environment, not their impairment. Another common model is the medical model, which typically sees the person from a diagnostic point of view. Another common model is the charity model. This posits interventions or policies are done in the best interest of the person with a disability, without including them or their experiences in the decision-making process. Also, using terms like mentally retarded, handicapped, are disrespectful and possibly hurtful. Always ask the person how they choose to identify, but default to person first language if you don't know.
So any thoughts after watching that? It's pretty foundational, but for me coming into this field, I really had to focus on person first language in the beginning. And it's some people call it being politically correct, but really in my mind, I think it's being respectful to people. People do not want to be, their whole identity is not wrapped around their disability. It's part of them as a person. And there are some groups like the deaf community and even some people with autism that want to be referred to by those terms. But what I would say is just refer to person first language, defer to it in the beginning. And if a person tells you that, no, I am deaf with a capital D, which I've heard many times in my career, then you can take that lead from them. Any thoughts from anyone else?
Could you just this was on the first slide, but it was a little too quick. Could you just give an example of how we would write out or say the people first language?
So I use all the time a person with disability, never disabled people. So that's the biggest one. And then if you take that further, a person who may have visual difficulties, a person who may experience autism. Those are just a couple of examples, and we've got a really good postcard, person first postcard that we can make available in bulk that we hand out almost everywhere that we go. If we were in person, we would have them for you. So we'll make sure that we get some of those up to you guys.
I can also, I think, put the file in the chat if anyone's interested in that as well. I will search that out here in a second. Any other thoughts or questions before I move on?
We've been switching most of our public health model to using person first language when we talk about people who struggle with addiction or, you know, are currently struggling with housing. You know, it's kind of just shifting the whole model, not just for people with disabilities, but talking about the person first rather than the, you know, issue that we might be addressing in our public health world. And I know it's also being used more in the medical field too. So rather than a diabetic, it's a person with diabetes, you know, so it's kind of the whole, a lot of fields are trying to get there, but this is a great example of how we can use it in everyday life too.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, one, I can't remember who I got it from, but the person who experiences homelessness or addiction or a disability, I feel like that is a powerful way to really think about, like, okay, not only is it a person, it's a person who's having this, who's informed by this experience. That's just helpful verbiage for my brain. Just works well for me that way. Okay, just a couple kind of last closing thoughts here. So best practices, I think, like for new situations, like when you're not sure, you don't know this person, you don't have a relationship, like what do you do? Defaulting to person first. If you don't understand, ask. I've supported multiple people who have significant, oh my gosh, speech barriers. I'm like losing my terms right now. And they can be difficult to understand their verbal language. But 9 times out of 10, that person just wants to know that you understand what they said. And so trying to like minimize discomfort by just glossing over it and being like, oh yeah, not super respectful. Like, the person really wants to be understood. So ask, ask, I didn't catch that. Will you say that again? Asking if somebody needs help before just offering to help them. You see this a lot with like either folks who are blind or low vision, or folks who use a wheelchair. When somebody moving them or somebody taking their arm to take them somewhere, totally disrespectful, never do that. And then the last piece is just nothing about me without me. That's kind of a catchphrase in our industry, but you sometimes see like, for instance, a potential employer, somebody addressing the employment specialist instead of the employee about like, hey, I really need these tasks done today. Don't tell me, tell your employee, they work for you. So some pieces like that. Ditto, if mom comes to pick them up, not Charlie did a great job at work today, mom, but Charlie, you did an awesome job at work today. So really directing your communication towards the person.
So just a quick story to share about that. I went to lunch with a friend of mine that has disabilities, and this lady came up to me and said, oh, it's just great that you work with people like this. And I was not playing a professional role with that person. It is a true, genuine friendship. And so it just shows the stereotypes that sometimes we have when we see a person with a disability with somebody else out in the community. So this slide that Angie put up is something I get asked to do a lot of presentations about. How do you work with people with disabilities? And I love to throw this out there because I bring this to a presentation if I agree to do it and say, here it is, end of presentation.
So true. Like a person. I feel like I've said that 1,000 times today. Like, this is not, it just doesn't have to be specific for a person with a disability. It's for everyone.
Right.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you. I'm sorry we're going to run a couple minutes over, but we do want to let everybody know about our business breakfast that's coming up on October 5th. Talks a little more about supported employment, how you can get involved. how that might look for your business. So I'm going to put the link to register in the chat box. And when you register, you will get a free, is it a coupon, Lance, to Diedrich Espresso?
Yeah, so $10, up to $10 gift certificate from Dietrich Espresso to get a cup of coffee and maybe a little Danish on your way to spending your virtual breakfast with us. And Angie just put it in the chat. Thank you very much. So I appreciate the time to spend with you today. Hopefully there was a few tidbits that you took away from this presentation. It was great doing this with you, Angie. I know you're more visible in Skagit County, but our commitment is there to the people that we serve and the people that live there. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Angie Ramsey and Lance Morehouse from Sherwood, explaining great tips that can really help us with supporting an inclusive workforce. Want to let you know we have one more training in our series, Accommodations in the ADA, presented by Washington Vocational Services next week. We will be using the same link as we had before, which is the Burlington Chamber link. Also want to let you know that October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and we are putting in the chat box a tool for businesses, a toolkit for supporting your business to honor the month October, National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which commemorates the many and varied contributions of people with disabilities to America's workplaces and economy. The theme this year is America's Recovery Powered by Inclusion, which is a powerful tribute to the many frontline workers with disabilities who provide essential services during this pandemic. And finally, a big thank you to Burlington Chamber, to Alyssa and Chloe for bringing us here today and sponsoring this chamber. And if you're watching this recording, thank you for taking the time to learn more about how to create an inclusive workforce.